I used to think support was something you earned, like a reward for being good, quiet, useful. I waited for it the way some people wait for spring, believing that if I endured the cold long enough, warmth would come. But warmth didn't come. Not in the way I imagined. I grew up in a house where silence was the loudest sound, where emotions were folded neatly and stored out of sight, where love was practical and pain was private. I learned early how to disappear in plain sight, how to smile without joy, how to nod when I wanted to scream. I became good at being needed, not in the way that invites closeness, but in the way that makes you indispensable. I fixed things. I remembered birthdays. I listened. I held space for others, even when I had none left for myself. People called me reliable. They said I was strong. But strength for me was a kind of quiet collapse, a slow erosion of self beneath the weight of everyone else's needs. I didn't know how to ask for help, not because I didn't want it, but because I didn't believe I deserved it. There was a time when I thought love would save me, that if I found someone gentle enough, they'd see the parts of me I kept hidden, and maybe they'd hold them with care. Maybe they'd say, "You don't have to carry this alone." But love, as I experienced it, was often conditional. It came with expectations, with roles to play, with the quiet threat of abandonment if I stopped performing. I remember one relationship in particular. She was kind, in the way people are when they don't know how to be cruel. But she didn't see me. Not really. She saw the version of me that made her life easier. The one who didn't argue. Who said, "It's okay," even when it wasn't. Who absorbed her sadness like a sponge and never leaked. When she left, she said, "You're too calm. I need someone who challenges me." And I nodded, as if that made sense. As if being calm was a flaw. As if my quiet was a failure. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just sat in the empty apartment and listened to the hum of the refrigerator. It was the only sound that didn't ask anything of me. That night, I wrote in my journal. It wasn't a statement of despair. It was a recognition. A beginning. In the weeks that followed, I stopped trying to be useful. Not entirely, but enough to notice the discomfort it caused. I said no to things I used to say yes to. I let messages go unanswered. I stopped apologizing for being tired. It felt unnatural, like walking with shoes on the wrong feet. But it also felt honest. I started spending time alone, not the kind of alone that feels like punishment, but the kind that feels like permission. I walked without destination. I sat in cafes and watched people move through their lives. I let myself be unproductive. And in that stillness, something shifted. I began to hear myself. Not the voice I used with others, but the one I'd buried beneath years of accommodation. It was quiet, tentative, but it was mine. It said things like, "I didn't believe it at first, but I listened." Support, I realized, isn't always external. It's not always a hand reaching out. Sometimes, it's the way you speak to yourself when no one else is listening. I began to practice that. Not perfectly, not consistently, but intentionally. I wrote affirmations that felt awkward. I cooked meals just for me. I bought flowers without occasion. I started naming my needs, not out loud, but in writing. I wrote. And slowly, I began to meet those needs. Not all at once. Not always well. But with effort. I became my own witness. My own caretaker. My own home. It wasn't dramatic. There was no breakthrough. Just a series of small choices that added up to something resembling self-respect. I still felt lonely sometimes. Still wished for someone to say, "I see you." But I stopped waiting. I stopped believing that support had to come from outside. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could give. I started asking myself, "What do you need today?" And I tried to answer honestly. Some days, the answer was silence. Other days, movement. Sometimes, grief. I let all of it be valid. I let myself be complex, messy, human. And in doing so, I discovered a kind of strength I hadn't known before. Not the strength of endurance. But the strength of self-compassion. That's where this part ends. Not with resolution, but with a quiet turning inward. A beginning that doesn't need permission. Valentin is learning. Not how to be perfect, but how to be present, with himself, for himself. And that, I think, is the first step toward becoming your own support. There's a strange kind of ache that doesn't come from heartbreak, but from the slow realization that no one is coming, not to rescue, not to reassure, not to say, "You're doing enough." I felt it most on the quiet days. Not the ones filled with tasks or noise, but the ones where silence stretched long and wide, like a sheet pulled too tight. I'd wake up, make tea, sit by the window, and feel the weight of my own presence. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was something more subtle. Like standing in a room with no mirrors, unable to see myself, unsure if I was even there. I used to fill that space with productivity. If I couldn't feel seen, I could at least feel useful. I'd clean, organize, write lists, answer emails. I'd measure my worth in completed tasks. But eventually, even that stopped working. The lists got shorter. The satisfaction faded. And I was left with the question I'd been avoiding. Who am I when I'm not needed? I didn't have an answer. So I did what I always do. I observed. Not others. Myself. I watched how I moved through the day. How I flinched when someone raised their voice, even if it wasn't directed at me. How I hesitated before expressing an opinion, afraid it might be too much. How I smiled in conversations that drained me, just to keep things smooth. It was exhausting. Not because I was doing too much, but because I was doing too little for myself. I started writing again. Not poetry this time, just raw thoughts. Unfiltered. Unedited. I wrote about the fear of being forgotten. About the guilt of resting. About the way I'd learned to shrink myself to fit into spaces that were never built for me. I didn't share these words with anyone. They weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be released. Some days I felt strong. I'd go for walks, cook meals, light candles just for myself. I'd feel the quiet pride of choosing myself, even in small ways. But other days, I felt hollow. I'd stare at the ceiling for hours, unable to move. I'd question everything, my choices, my worth, my voice. I'd wonder if this journey toward self-support was just another form of isolation. But even in those moments, I didn't abandon myself. I didn't rush to fix the feeling. I didn't shame myself for being low. I just stayed. I let the discomfort speak. I let the silence stretch. I let myself be human. I began to notice patterns. How I reached for my phone when I felt anxious. How I replayed old conversations, searching for signs that I was loved. How I avoided mirrors on days when I felt invisible. And instead of judging these patterns, I started to meet them with curiosity. I asked myself, gently, what are you trying to soothe? What are you afraid of? What do you need? The answers weren't always clear. But the act of asking was enough. It was a kind of self-parenting. A way of saying, I'm here. I'm listening. I started creating small rituals. Not for productivity, but for presence. I'd light a candle before writing. I'd play music while cooking. I'd sit outside for 10 minutes each morning, just to feel the air on my skin. These rituals didn't fix anything. But they reminded me that I existed. That I mattered. That I could be gentle with myself. I also began to redefine what support meant. It wasn't grand gestures or constant reassurance. It was consistency. It was showing up for myself, even when I didn't feel like it. It was choosing rest over guilt. Boundaries over people-pleasing. Truth over performance. I stopped chasing validation. Not because I didn't want it, but because I realized it couldn't replace self-trust. I stopped explaining my choices to people who didn't understand me. I stopped apologizing for my sensitivity, my slowness, my depth. I started honoring them instead. There were setbacks. Of course there were. Days when I slipped into old habits. When I said yes out of fear. When I ignored my own needs to avoid conflict. But each time I returned. Not with punishment, but with patience. I reminded myself, this is a practice, not a perfection. And slowly, I began to feel something new. Not happiness, exactly, but steadiness. A quiet knowing that I could hold myself. That I didn't need to be rescued. That I was building something inside, something resilient, something real. That's where this part ends. Not with triumph, but with tenderness. Not with answers, but with the courage to keep asking. Valentin is still in the middle of the mess. But now, he's not running from it. He's sitting with it. And that, in itself, is a kind of support. Some lessons don't arrive gently. They come disguised as ordinary days, as familiar faces, as moments that seem harmless until they press against the softest parts of you. I didn't expect to see her again. Not in that cafe, not in that light. She was sitting by the window, laughing with someone new. Her hair was shorter. Her posture more relaxed. She looked like someone who had moved on. I stood in line, pretending not to notice. Pretending I hadn't once memorized the way she stirred her coffee, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. I ordered tea, sat at the far end, and tried to breathe. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't grief. It was something quieter. A flicker of the old instinct, the urge to shrink, to disappear, to make myself small enough not to be a disruption. I felt it rise in my chest like a tide. But I didn't move. I stayed. That was the test. Not of strength, but of self-trust. Could I remain in my own presence, even when discomfort knocked? Could I choose myself, not by leaving, but by staying? I sipped my tea slowly. Let the heat anchor me. Let the moment pass without reaction. She didn't see me. And that was okay. I didn't need to be seen to exist. Later, walking home, I felt the weight of that choice. It wasn't dramatic. No one clapped. No one said, "Well done." But I knew. I had stayed. I had chosen not to abandon myself. That evening, I wrote in my journal. The days that followed were quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. I felt tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from holding yourself together for too long. I didn't want to write. Didn't want to cook. Didn't want to talk. So I didn't. I let myself be still. I let the fatigue speak. I didn't rush to fix it. I didn't shame myself for it. I just let it be. That, too, was support. I began to understand that being my own support wasn't about constant motivation. It wasn't about pushing through. It was about listening. About honoring the ebb as much as the flow. I started tracking my energy, not in numbers, but in feelings. I'd ask myself each morning. I gave myself permission to do less. To be less. To rest without guilt. To exist without explanation. And in that space, something shifted. I began to feel more real. Not more productive. Not more impressive. Just more present. I stopped performing wellness. Stopped curating my healing. I let it be messy. Let it be slow. Let it be mine. One afternoon, I received a message from an old friend. We hadn't spoken in years. He said he missed me. Said he'd been thinking about the way I used to listen, how I made space for others without judgment. I stared at the message for a long time. Not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to reopen that door. I remembered how I used to show up for him. How I'd absorb his chaos, his grief, his anger. How I'd leave those conversations feeling hollow. I didn't reply right away. I sat with the discomfort. I asked myself. The answer wasn't clear, but the question mattered. Eventually, I replied. Gently, honestly. I said I was learning to care for myself first. That I wasn't always available in the ways I used to be. That I still valued him, but I had boundaries now. He didn't respond. And that was okay. I didn't spiral. Didn't chase. Didn't apologize. I honored my truth. I supported myself. Support, I've learned, isn't always visible. It's not always a warm bath or a kind word. Sometimes, it's the decision not to explain. Not to justify. Not to shrink. It's the quiet refusal to betray yourself for comfort. It's the choice to stay in the room, even when your past walks in. It's the courage to rest, even when the world demands movement. It's the whisper, "I'm here. I've got you." That's where this part ends. Not with resolution, but with resilience. Valentin is still learning, still stumbling, still choosing. But now he knows, support isn't something he waits for. It's something he becomes. There comes a moment when the work stops feeling like survival and starts feeling like creation. Not because the pain disappears, but because it begins to shape something new. Something rooted. Something that doesn't need to be proven. For a long time, I thought healing would make me lighter. That once I learned to support myself, I'd float above the weight of old wounds, untouched by disappointment or fear. But that's not what happened. What happened was deeper. I didn't become lighter. I became grounded. I started noticing the difference between solitude and isolation, between boundaries and walls, between self-respect and self-defense. These lines used to blur. I used to confuse silence with safety, distance with dignity. But now, I could feel the difference in my body, in my breath, in the way I moved through rooms without shrinking. I no longer needed to be understood to feel valid. I no longer needed to be chosen to feel worthy. I no longer needed to be useful to feel real. That was new. That was mine. I began to build my days around care, not obligation. I chose softness over speed, honesty over harmony. I let go of the version of myself that existed only to soothe others. I didn't abandon him. I thanked him. He kept me safe when I didn't know how. But I didn't need him anymore. I started showing up differently. Not louder. Not harder. Just clearer. I spoke with more pauses. I asked for space without guilt. I said, "I don't know," without shame. I let myself be unfinished. And people responded. Some with distance. Some with discomfort. But some with depth. The ones who stayed didn't need me to perform. They met me where I was. And I met myself there too. I began to trust my own timing. I stopped rushing grief. Stopped editing joy. Stopped apologizing for the way I process the world. I let myself be slow. Let myself be strange. Let myself be sincere. I started writing again, not to explain, but to express. Not for clarity, but for connection. My words weren't polished. They were honest. And that was enough. I began to see support not as a structure, but as a soil. Something I could grow from. Something I could return to. Something I could become. I was no longer waiting. No longer reaching. No longer bending. I was standing. Not perfectly. Not always. But truly. And that's what I mean when I say, I learned to be my own support. Not because I stopped needing others, but because I stopped abandoning myself. Not because I became invincible, but because I became whole. Not because the world changed, but because I did. And now, when the silence comes, I don't fear it. I listen. I breathe. I stay. Because I know, I am here. And I've got me.